Peter wants to grow up. Unfortunately, everyone else wants him to grow up immediately and somewhere else.
Hey, Peter.
Swing.
Swing! Swing!
This episode sits at an interesting crossroads for the Mindy Project because it's trying to juggle three things at once. Growing up, settling down, and realizing that those two things don't mean the same thing for everyone involved. On paper, the setup seems obvious. Peter needs a new place to live, Danny has an extra apartment, Jeremy is babysitting a child he is wildly unprepared for. These are sitcom storylines we've all seen before. But what keeps this episode from being a total throwaway is that it quietly exposes a disconnect, especially between Mindy and Danny, about who they're picturing when they think about the future. And that tension is real, it's relatable, and it's frustrating in a way that relationships often are. No villains, no grand betrayals, just two people not quite talking about the same thing. Unfortunately, the episode doesn't always trust that emotional undercurrent, and instead leans hard on familiar beats and obvious turns. Sometimes that works, sometimes it really doesn't. So with that in mind, welcome back to The Rank. I'm John, and today we're going to be ranking the 10th episode of the third season of the Mindy Project titled, What About Peter? Written by Ike Barinholtz and David Stassen, and directed by David Stassen. So let's find out how this one stacked up, starting with the episode overview. So we start the episode with a Mindy voiceover, as we often do, and the voiceover is all about how manly Danny is. Mindy says that Danny can cook a really great steak in about 10 minutes. And then we see him giving her a steak, and by the time that he's finished talking about how you need to massage the steak sensually before you cook it, she has already finished it. And then she grabs the other steak with her hands, and he's like, oh, that's hot, and just starts eating it. But the other part of Danny's manliness is that he's handy. Now, personally, I don't have any issue with making a steak, I can do that, but I wish I was handy. And what's worse is that my dad was a contractor, and besides that was an amazing sculptor and whittler. So I have no excuse, I just didn't get the handy genes. Anyone else out there jealous of not being the handyman that they wish they could be? Anyway, Mindy is gonna further explain that she needs a backup guy to do the stuff that isn't manly, like going with her to a Rihanna book signing. And for that backup, she brings Peter. And this is how we end up getting to see Peter's living situation. Mindy's gonna insist on going inside his apartment, even though he's telling her not to. And then, it's awful. Or a lot of fun, I guess, depending upon your perspective. We're introduced to his roommates, Pube and Bush, who's a Kennedy. And one of the roommates is gonna say, so you're a woman, that's cool. And Mindy responds by saying that she is indeed a woman, a litigious gun-owning woman. So we're gonna get a bunch of frat boy stuff here. Like they spray painted Pete's dog. They keep getting Mindy's undergarments with a lacrosse stick somehow without her realizing it at all. And we also find out that Bush made out with his sister, or half-sister as he corrects everyone. So after this harrowing experience at Peter's apartment, wouldn't you know it, Danny is deciding to rent out his other apartment. Seems fortuitous for Peter, but the show isn't gonna let the audience know that that's what they're thinking of doing just yet. Which feels a little silly, cause come on, it's obvious. Either way, Mindy is talking about going to brunch and how Danny should come with her to brunch cause he never hangs out with friends, and later she's gonna go be with the interns. But Danny turns her down for brunch because his contractor is coming to put the backsplash in his second apartment. And this contractor is what's going to be leading us to another plot point that's more of a series plot than an episode plot. Because when Ray, his contractor, comes over, Danny asks him about breaking down the wall to combine the two apartments. Why does he want to do this? Well, Danny explains he wants to do this for his family. Now, this just made me think, I don't remember the episode where they introduced the second apartment that well, but I feel like it was down the hall and across the hall from his apartment. So I don't know how they're breaking down a wall to combine them, but I could be wrong. Now, he spent a bunch of time developing and starting the A story. So let's head over to the B story and find out what it's going to be. And we get introduced to the B story by Lauren, who's back for this episode, but only for a couple seconds. They brought this actress in just to give the setup to the B story, which is that Jeremy is going to babysit her son, Henry. And for those of you who haven't been following along, or maybe you haven't been watching, Lauren is the woman that was dating Peter, and then Jeremy stole her away from him. Anyway, Morgan is going to overhear this, and he's going to offer to help Jeremy, who cockily refuses. So we've developed an A story here that feels very obvious. Peter is going to end up in the extra apartment. And now we've got a B story that also feels very obvious, that Jeremy is going to suck at babysitting, and then Morgan's going to come and help him. Now, I don't necessarily need to be shocked at the direction that things are heading, but I also didn't really think it made sense to tease this. Next we're going to see Mindy come to the realization oh, Peter should take the apartment. And it's just well, no shit. And then later, Morgan's gonna come to Jeremy's rescue, and it was also like, yeah, no shit. The realization for Mindy comes when she's in the intern scene, who were all brought back just like Lauren for just a couple of seconds. So basically they were there to set up this next joke from Peter, who as they leave, comes into frame and says, "Schwing," which, that's funny, but then he goes on to say how he doesn't like his roommates and that he's trying to bring home classier ladies. Like recently he just tried to bring home a lawyer and she ended up getting Lyme disease. And it's after that anecdote where Mindy goes, "Oh, you should take the apartment that Danny has, the extra one." But she's got to convince Danny, who doesn't think it's a good idea. He's worried because he thinks that by having a friend move in, that said friend, Peter, is going to think that he can just come over uninvited whenever he wants. But Mindy convinces him, "Oh, it's not going to be like that, don't worry." Soon after, though, on Peter's first night there, we find out that when he told his roommates he was leaving, they stabbed his waterbed. So he has nothing to sleep on. And Mindy goes, "Well, sleep on the couch." Which Danny again is like, "What? No." But of course he eventually just is like, "Yeah, fine, whatever." So Mindy and him go back to his bedroom, and Mindy's like, let's get frisky, let's get down, right? But Danny doesn't want to with Peter out there. He doesn't want Peter knowing his sounds. Either way, they don't do it, and Mindy decides to stay up and watch TV with Peter. So now we're gonna head back to the B story, where Jeremy is clearly having a hard time watching Henry, and Morgan shows up out of the blue. Why did he show up? Because he knew that Jeremy was gonna need his help. Of course, the crying Henry stops as soon as Morgan holds him, which makes Jeremy jealous, but then Morgan's like, no, it's not because of that. It's just, he's probably tired out from crying, and if I give him back to you, he'll still be fine. So when he hands it back to Jeremy, of course, the kid immediately starts crying again. And all of this is like normal sitcom inept man watching a kid comedy, right? But that's that whole scene. So then we head back to the A story. And we're going to see a box of cannolis on the counter with a note from Mindy saying, "Hey, sorry, we didn't have sex last night." Then we see that she has clearly eaten all of the cream out of the middle of the cannolis, which is both funny and super gross. Now, while he's reading this note and looking at the empty cannolis, we hear the shower running in the background. So, thinking about the fact they didn't have sex last night, Danny's like, "All right, let's go make this happen." So he's gonna go get in the shower with her. Of course, everybody knew that that was not gonna be Mindy in the shower. It was Peter. Though despite the obviousness of the joke, it did still make me laugh when they were both trying to exit the shower at the same time and got stuck. So naturally, Danny is ready to kick Peter out. But once again, Mindy convinces Danny to let Peter stay. So after she convinces him, we get a quick sojourn back to the B story. And Jeremy is leaving. He's giving up on babysitting. But right as he's about to leave, Henry says, "Peter." This, and the fact that Morgan says that Lauren will definitely break up with him if he gives up on this, convinces him to stay. So we cut back to Mindy, and Ray shows up at the apartment. And he's going to tell Mindy to tell Danny that he checked with the city and that Danny can expand the apartment for his family. This is going to send Mindy on a tailspin of excitement, and she goes over and immediately evicts Peter. Poor Peter, right? But you can't blame Mindy. She's got to lock down Danny's perfectly proportioned penis, according to her. So then we're going to head right back to Morgan and Jeremy, where we're going to get a fun continuity joke here. Morgan's going to take off his shirt, and he's got a tattoo on his stomach that they showed back in season 1 that says, "No more stealing cars," around like his belly button. But basically what this scene is about is that they're going to discover what is going to make Henry relax, and that is that Jeremy is going to hurt himself. Straight from the pages of Monsters, Inc. So after that quick scene, we're going to head back to Mindy and Danny, and Mindy is drinking Danny's terrible homemade beer in an effort to get him to ask her to move in. But this plan is cut short when they hear DMX's "Party Up" playing super loudly in Peter's apartment. Well, apparently Peter's roommates came over and threw him a going away party because of the unceremonious way in which he was evicted. Mindy's super upset. She's like, "You're gonna ruin this apartment before I get a chance to live in it," which I think is kind of funny because she did live in it for like a month. That was like how we found out about the other apartment. But anyway, Danny overhears us and is like, "Yeah, wait, what?" And then Peter smugly says, "Oh, you don't know what this one is thinking." But soon after, we're gonna find out that Danny was talking about combining the apartments to bring his mom into the other apartment, which is so disappointing for poor Mindy. Then Peter defenestrates himself by slip and sliding across the island counter so fast that he goes out the window. And in the next scene, we're going to see Peter in the hospital and Danny has come to visit him. And we get another moment where Danny is just a moron. He doesn't understand why Mindy is upset. How is it that Peter understands this, but Danny doesn't? Peter's going to have to remind him, "You read her diary, she's all in." And Danny's like, "Oh yeah, I guess so." But either way, Danny's going to end up telling Peter to stay in the apartment, which is nice for Peter. But it's also kind of fucked up, all like the emotional turmoil they put him through for this. So we're going to head back to the B story, and they've finally gotten the kid to sleep. And Morgan's like, this is great. Now Lauren's going to want you to do this all the time. And that's when the realization hits Jeremy. What if I just wanted a girlfriend and I didn't think things through? That was my terrible British accent. But I like that Morgan just sort of shrugs like, man, I don't know. And then he goes to leave, but ends up knocking something over and making a whole bunch of noise, which means Henry wakes up and starts crying immediately. And instead of helping, Morgan just is like, okay, bye, and leaves. So that's the conclusion to the B story. And really, we've already had the conclusion to the A story because Peter is going to stay at the apartment now. But the unresolved moment about the second apartment is still lingering. So they have Mindy and Danny have a discussion about it. And Danny is basically saying that he was thinking, down the road it would be for his mom, not anything immediate. But also, he knows that she wants to move in together. And he's nervous about it, but he wants to try it. And then Mindy, which I really liked, was like, well, then ask me again sometime when you're not nervous about it. Now, this whole conversation is actually happening in that second apartment. And after Mindy leaves, it turns out Pube is still there. He's going to stand up and he's going to say, that's a good woman. You better not lose her. And Danny doesn't even turn around and just says, get out of my apartment. And that's how the episode ends. So let's find out how it ranked.
Rank.
So the rank is where I rank the episode based on 5 categories: story, acting, dialogue, episode coherence, and character relatability. I rank it on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. And then I have a laugh counter where I tally up the amount of times the episode made me laugh. 1 point per laugh out loud gets added to the score. And before I dive into the rankings here, I just want to say, if you're enjoying this episode, please leave a like down below. It really does help me out. But without further ado, the first category is story. And this all felt so formulaic and sort of slapped together. It's like they pulled a couple storylines from a hat and were like, well, let's do this. It's just that everything just felt so obvious. Peter needs a new place to stay, and Danny just happens to be letting an apartment. And the B story is a story about a man who doesn't know how to take care of young children. The same sort of story that they tell every single time this comes up, and told in the exact same way they do it every other time. I gave it a 2. That brings us to acting, and the acting was definitely not the problem in this episode. Actually, Mindy and Danny were excellent in this. Especially Mindy, who portrayed giddiness and sadness and hope, all with just facial expressions throughout this episode. Even Ike and Ed, who are typically the weaker links in acting, were pretty good. So I gave it a 4.75. So this brings us to dialogue. Normally, I can count on this aspect of the show being excellent, but it was weak in this one. It didn't make me laugh as much as it usually does, and the obvious directions they went with for every facet of the story made it less engaging. Anyway, I think it was a weak episode. I gave it a 2.25. So that brings us to episode coherence. Well, considering that it was an incredibly formulaic story, it's not going to take much to cohere. I will say the question that popped into my mind, which I mentioned during the overview, wasn't Danny's other apartment on the other side of the hall? So how would he break down the wall to combine them? But I don't want to docket points for that, because I don't remember for sure if I'm right. I was a little annoyed about Danny's cluelessness again. I get that he tends to be clueless. It just seems like there should be some growth there, and it feels like there's not. I think the coherence for Peter and Mindy are excellent, though. They're very true to their characters, and I like that Peter keeps having stops and starts with trying to grow up. However, what is going on with Jeremy? Is he the responsible guy now or not? But it really feels like I don't have a good sense of his character. And that, to me, is a problem with coherence. So I gave it a 3.5. And that brings us to the last category, which is character relatability. And I think everyone's pretty relatable here. The B story is an interesting one because it's very blah, but it's also very relatable. The whole realization that dating a woman with a young child means that you'll have to be a father figure to this child is daunting, and I get that. And I think that Peter's lifestyle change that he's trying to enact is also really relatable, as is Danny's concern for his mom in the future, and Mindy's disappointment that he's not thinking of her like that. It was all very good, except for maybe Danny's dumbness when it comes to Mindy's feelings. So I gave it a 4.75. So we had some decently high scores, and we had some fairly low scores here. So it's going to need a decent laugh counter to keep it in the top 3 tiers. And unfortunately, this is kind of a low laugh counter, especially for a Mindy Project episode. It only got me 10 times, which means the grand total of the episode is a 27.25, which puts it in the mediocre tier. And as for the series average, it goes down to a 36.9, which means it's staying in the holy grail. And if you're ranking along with me, please drop your scores in the comments. I'm curious to see what you guys felt about it. Also, the laugh counter. I want to know if maybe I just wasn't in a good enough mood to watch this episode or something. So thanks for watching and or listening. Check out my other Mindy Project ranking episodes or any of the other sitcom or movie ranking episodes. Remember to subscribe, comment, and like. For up-to-date rankings, you can check out my website at therankpodcast.com, where you can also email me at john@therankpodcast.com. patreon.com. And if you really want to support the show, you can become a patron at patreon.com/TheRankPodcast. But I'll leave you with this. Why did Peter leave the apartment through the window? Because he couldn't handle the pain.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
On paper, the setup seems obvious. Peter needs news.
Cut!
On paper, the setup seems
Cut!
On paper, the setup seems obvious. Peter needs a new. Jesus.
We're gonna be here a while.